Every species that joined the compact was given a number. Not a name, not a rank, not a seat at any table that mattered, a number. The compact called it the luminosity index, and it measured exactly one thing: how much light a body could survive touching. The viral topped the registry, their skin a lattice of photosynthetic glass that drank starlight the way other creatures drank water. Behind them came the Doskai, whose armored hides shrugged off solar flares that would cook a continent. Further down the list sat 100 other species, each one calibrated against the same brutal arithmetic. How close could you stand to a star before it killed you, and how long could you stay there smiling? Humanity sat at the very bottom. Number 112. Dead last out of 112 civilizations that had ever been measured. A human being, stripped of every suit and shield ever built, would blister and die under direct starlight faster than almost anything else the galaxy had ever bothered to catalog. The Compact's report on Earth ran 400 pages, and the conclusion fit in one sentence: fragile, dim, and useful only as labor. So that was the job they were given. Labor. On Kesarine Station, a rust-colored scaffold of alloy and glass bolted to the outer skin of a dying star system, 200 humans worked the maintenance shifts nobody else wanted. Because nobody else could stomach the tedium, the isolation, the years spent in the shadow of a star everyone else was too important to watch. The star was called Ashkevrin's Eye. It had been dying for longer than any species in the registry had existed, and it was scheduled in the Compact's own patient language to finish dying sometime in the next several centuries. Nobody expected it to matter this year. Nobody expected it to matter for a long, long time. The posting came with a joke attached, one that had traveled through every rotation of crew long before Okoro's people arrived to inherit it. Kesarine Station, the joke went, was where the Compact sent species it had already finished measuring. There was nothing left to discover about 112th place. There was only the schedule, the slow data, and the long, patient work of watching something enormous die by inches, decade after decade, for an audience that had stopped paying attention generations ago. None of the 200 people who lived and worked there had chosen the posting for glory. Most had chosen it because it was steady, because it paid, because after climbing whatever ladder the Compact allowed a low-ranked species to climb, a quiet star at the edge of an unimportant system was as close to control over one's own life as humanity was usually permitted to get. It was not resentment exactly that lived in the corridors of Kesarine Station. It was something closer to patience worn thin and folded neatly away, the way people fold away things they've decided not to spend energy on anymore. Aye. The measure of a station Myril Okoro had commanded worse postings, though not many. She had spent 11 years in the Compact service, climbing from freight clerk to station chief through a combination of stubbornness and a talent for keeping equipment running long after its warranty and its dignity had both expired. Kesarine Station ran on human patchwork, the way a farmhouse runs on baling wire, ugly, improvised, and somehow never failing at the worst possible moment, because the worst possible moment was the only moment humans ever really planned for. The station's official purpose was survey and relay. Watch the dying star, catalog its slow decline, forward the data up the chain to researchers who would never visit and would barely read the reports. It was, by every metric the Compact cared about, the least prestigious posting in the sector, which was, Okoro often thought, exactly why it had been given to them. Her second, a wiry engineer named Tomas Reyes, had a theory about the assignment that he shared with anyone who'd stand still long enough to hear it. The Compact didn't send humans to unimportant places because humans were unimportant, he argued. They sent humans to unimportant places because unimportant places were where things went wrong first, and nobody trusted the Viral or the Doskai to notice, let alone care. Okoro never fully agreed with him, but she never fully disagreed either. There was a particular kind of contempt in being handed the jobs no one else wanted, dressed up as trust. She had learned to live inside that contradiction the way her crew had learned to live inside pressure suits 3 sizes too rigid for comfort, not because it fit, but because it was what they'd been given and the work still needed doing. She kept a small ritual, one she'd never told anyone about, not even Reyes. Once a shift, she walked the length of the outer ring alone and looked out at Ashkevrin's Eye through the observation glass, not because the star was beautiful, though it was, but because it reminded her that some things simply did not care how the Compact ranked them. The star did not know it was dying slowly. It did not know anyone was watching. It only burned at its own pace, indifferent to every index ever written about it, and there was something in that indifference Okoro found she needed some mornings more than she needed sleep. What none of them knew on the ordinary morning the alarms began was that Ashkevrin's Eye had quietly finished the slow process of dying decades ahead of every projection in the Compact's 400-page report. Stars, it turned out, did not read reports. They simply collapsed on their own schedule and let everyone else find out after. The collapse, the first alarm was small, a pressure fluctuation in the outer relay, the kind of hiccup that happened twice a week and meant nothing. Reyes silenced it without looking up from his coffee. The second alarm was not small, it came 4 minutes later and it did not stop. Ashkevrin's eye was shedding its outer layers in a controlled implosion that the compact's own models called statistically impossible for another 140 years. The star's core had quietly crossed a threshold nobody had been watching closely enough to catch, and now it was folding in on itself, and in 11 hours the energy released from that collapse, a wavefront of hard radiation and light pressure powerful enough to strip atmospheres, would wash over Kesarine Station on its way to 3 inhabited colonies deeper in the system. Colony populations combined 4,112,000 people, none of them viral, none of them Doskai. A mixed settlement of 11 species, most of them mid-table on the index, none of them built to survive what was coming. The station's automated defense grid, a compact standard shield array installed decades ago and never once used in anger, should have been able to blunt the wavefront and buy the colonies time to evacuate or shelter. It should have. But the same collapse that unleashed the wavefront had scrambled the grid's control relay, buried deep in the station's spine, in a maintenance shaft that ran directly beneath what would very shortly become the most lethal patch of open space in the system. Someone would have to go in by hand and physically reroute the relay before the wavefront arrived. Not send a drone, the drone's processors would fry in the leading edge of the radiation long before they finished the job. Not remote trigger a fix, the relay's manual override had no remote interface, a design flaw nobody had ever bothered to correct because no one had ever imagined needing it. A person would have to climb into that shaft in a suit and finish the repair while the light of a dying star closed in around them like a fist. Okoro sent the emergency signal up the compact's chain within minutes, the way protocol demanded, and within the hour received the reply protocol also demanded. Acknowledgement, sympathy, and the quiet, unstated fact that no rescue vessel rated for the coming radiation existed within 11 hours of Kesarine Station. The nearest compact relief ship, crewed by Doskai engineers whose armored hides could not survive the wavefront any better than glass could, was 4 days out. Ashkevrin's eye did not care about compact response times. It never had. For the first time in the station's history, the chain of command that always ran upward towards some distant office that outranked them simply ran out. There was no one above Kesarine Station who could reach them in time. There was no one below them who could be sent in their place. There was only the 200 people already standing on the station, and 11 hours, and a shaft that led straight down into the coming light. IV, the volunteers Okoro called the station's full complement to the main deck and told them exactly what the situation was, because she had never believed in softening the truth for people whose lives depended on hearing it clearly. The relay had to be fixed within 9 hours to leave any margin for the shield to charge. Whoever went into that shaft would be exposed to radiation levels the compact's own charts rated as instantly lethal to every species above humanity on the index. The viral's glass skin would boil, the Doskai's armored hide would crack apart at the cellular level. Every species built to endure Starlight would be undone by this particular concentrated dose of it. Humanity's rating on the index had always been calculated against exposure meant to be survived long afternoons under an alien sun, the low ambient bombardment of normal stellar life. No one had ever measured what happened when a fragile, low-rated body was given real shielding and sent briefly into something meant to kill anything nearby because no one had ever thought it worth measuring. Fragile did not mean helpless, it only meant no one had checked. Reyes did the math out loud, the way he did everything, thinking with his mouth. Human suits layered properly, rated for short, intense bursts rather than compact standards, long, low exposure, might buy a person enough time inside that shaft to finish the reroute before the dose became unsurvivable. Might, not would. He gave it by his own honest estimate, 1 chance in 3 of anyone coming back out. Every hand in the room went up before he finished the sentence. Okoro had expected some hands. She had not expected all of them. 200 people who had been told, for their entire lives and the lives of every generation before them, that they were the weakest link in a galaxy of giants, and every one of them volunteered to walk into a dying star to save 4 million strangers who had never once bothered to learn their names. She chose 4. Reyes, because he understood the relay better than anyone alive. Priya Anand, the station's youngest engineer, because her hands were steadiest under pressure and everyone on the crew knew it. Dmitry Volkov, because he had rebuilt half the station's wiring with his bare hands and would know instantly if something had shifted since the schematics were drawn. And herself, because she had never once sent her crew somewhere she wasn't willing to go first. There was a moment, brief and almost unspoken, where the weight of the compact's old verdict passed through the room like a draft through a cracked seal. Fragile, dim, useful only as labor. 400 pages of careful measurement had concluded that a human body was the worst possible tool for surviving what was coming, and here they were, the worst possible tool in the galaxy, the only ones close enough, the only ones willing, the only ones left. Reyes broke the silence the way he broke most silences, with a dry, tired half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Somebody, he said, forgot to measure what happened when you gave the worst-rated species in the registry a reason to go anyway. Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to, they were already checking their suits. Into the shaft they suited up in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't fear so much as focus. 4 people checking each other's seals with the unhurried precision of people who had done this 1,000 times before, for reasons that mattered far less. The suits were human-built, patched and repatched over a decade of budget the compact never bothered increasing, and every one of them held. The maintenance shaft ran 300 meters down the station's spine, a narrow corridor of exposed conduit that put them, for the last 100 meters, outside every layer of shielding the station possessed. Ashkevran's eye was visible through the shaft's inspection ports the whole way down, no longer a star so much as a wound, its light gone the color of struck iron, brightening by the minute. Anand found the fault first, a coupling warped by the same energy surge that had triggered the collapse, fused just enough to break the relay circuit without breaking the housing around it, which meant it had to be freed by hand by feel with tools never designed for the job. She worked with her helmet lamp throwing long shadows up the conduit, murmuring measurements to Reyes, who called back corrections without ever raising his voice. The wavefront arrived early. Not by much, 40 minutes, an error margin the models had called negligible, but 40 minutes was the difference between finishing in shielded twilight and finishing in the open light of a star tearing itself apart. The shaft's inspection ports went white. Every suit alarm in the corridor screamed at once. For a handful of seconds, nobody moved. The light coming through the ports wasn't like anything any of them had trained for, not heat exactly, not brightness exactly, but a pressure, a physical weight pressing through the conduit walls. As if the shaft itself had been laid across the star's open palm and the palm was beginning slowly to close. Akoro felt it first in her teeth, then in the base of her skull, a hum that had no sound, only sensation. Volkov's dosimeter redlined within the first 90 seconds. He didn't stop working. Akoro's redlined 40 seconds after his. She didn't stop either. There is a particular kind of decision a person makes in that moment, not bravery exactly, nothing so clean as that, just the flat, practical understanding that stopping changes nothing except who lives with the outcome, and that finishing the job is still, somehow, the only thing left to control. Reyes kept talking the whole time, numbers and corrections and small useless jokes, because silence in that shaft would have meant listening to the alarms instead, and none of them could afford that kind of listening. Anand's hands shook harder with every passing minute, but she did not stop moving them. Akora would remember afterward that none of them had asked each other to keep going. It had simply never occurred to any of them to stop. Anand freed the coupling with 4 minutes left on Reyes' countdown. Her hands by then were shaking badly enough that Volkov had to guide the final connection into place, his fingers wrapped over hers inside 2 layers of scorched glove. The relay clicked home. Somewhere above them, decks away, the shield grid woke up and began, for the first time in its existence, to actually work. What light leaves behind they made it out of the shaft. All 4 of them on their own feet, though Volkov collapsed the moment his boots cleared the outer hatch and did not open his eyes again for 6 days. The shield held long enough to blunt the wavefront before it reached the colonies, not fully, the models had never promised fully, but enough. 4,112,000 people went on living, most of them never learning how close the margin had actually been, or whose hands had bought it. The compact's formal review took the better part of a year. It confirmed what Reyes had guessed in the corridor with a coffee going cold in his hand, that humanity's low rating on the luminosity index had measured the wrong thing entirely. It had measured how long a species could endure light. It had never once measured how much a species was willing to carry, and for how long once carrying it was the only option left. They revised the index that year quietly, without much fanfare, adding a second axis no one had thought to include before, not endurance but willingness. Humanity's number on that second axis had no equal in the registry. No species before them had ever scored it because no species before them had ever needed to. Akoro stayed on Kesarine Station another 6 years after that, training the crews that came after her, none of whom ever needed to walk into a dying star because the shield grid never failed again. She kept in her quarters a small fragment of the fused coupling Anand had freed by hand, ordinary metal, warped by ordinary heat, worth nothing to anyone who hadn't been in that shaft. She never explained it to visitors who asked. She didn't need to. The people who mattered already understood, because the galaxy, it turned out, had been asking the wrong question all along. It had spent 112 civilizations measuring how much light a body could survive, when the only number that had ever actually mattered was how much weight a person was willing to carry toward the people who needed them. And for humanity, alone among every species in the registry, that number had never once had a ceiling.